Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming out. Really appreciate it. I know we've got about 45 folks in the phone. I'm sorry, in the room, and I think we've probably got about another 20 or so online. So really good minutes. Thanks very much. We have a full agenda, so we're gonna jump in. So welcome to the quarterly meeting of the Energy Transformation Advisory Board. Really appreciate all the work that everybody has put in today and all the work of your teams. We've had a tremendous amount of engagement from your teams and a broader set of stakeholders across all the work groups. I hope everybody had a chance to take a look at the pre-read materials. We can see a lot of the work that's going on. We have a very substantive agenda today, and like all of our meetings, we're going to try to get through everything and get through it on time so that we can enjoy a reception afterwards. I sent an email out yesterday that shows who is posting that, and it will be at just right up and around the corner. So thank you for everyone who's providing support for that and for ELM to be of that. Give the next slide. So like I said, we have a packed agenda. Before we jump into the agenda, I do want to take a moment to know one thing. So I think for many of you who participated in our working groups or have been to our advisory board meetings, you know that we've been supported by a wonderful cohort of fellows from various academic institutions throughout Massachusetts over the past year. They were with us for a year. They did a tremendous amount of work, really helped get OET and the work groups up and running. That first inaugural cohort, they've all graduated. We had a ceremony at the Risk Institute at UMass Lowell on Friday. It was tremendous. And now we're welcoming our new cohort of fellows and will be with us for the next year. So I'm just going to quickly let them introduce themselves. I'm just going to tell you their name and where they're going to school.
Just testing you to do this. Hey, hi everybody. I'm Deanna. She, her pronouns. I'm over at Tufts University getting my master's degree.
Hi everyone, my name is Kai Kabilko. I'm a grad student at Northeastern.
Hi everybody, my name is Mia Peterson and I'm a sophomore at Boston University.
Hello, I'm Andrew Westerman and I'm also a master's student at Tufts.
Hello everyone, I'm Omin and I study PhD in mechanical engineering at UMass.
So welcome to our new fellows. Those of you that are on our work groups, you will see them. We're going to start supporting all those activities and you'll see them around at the advisory board. So today we do again have a pretty full agenda. We're going to do a couple of things. One, we're going to get an update on where we are on decarbonizing the Peak and Everett Marine Terminal, and there's a couple of votes on that. Basically, we're going to be voting to accept where we are at a high level. We will be more detailed, except where we are, and to kind of the final phase of both of those recommendations. Then Secretary Dever is going to come and provide some remarks. And after that, we will get an update on financing the transition. Again, we're kind of at a phase where we're moving from phase 2 to phase 3 work there. And so we have things we want to go over with the advisory board to make sure we're on the right track. And then we're going to do a deeper dive into the enabling sustainable economic development work group. That's when we're giving you some updates, but we have not had a deep dive discussion. So that's when we're going to have small table discussions to make sure we're on the right track and to highlight some of the things that we're going to be doing a deeper dive focus on and making sure that this group is supportive of that. And then we'll wrap up, talk about next steps, and then we can all see each other as I can make it to urination. So go to the next slide. So I will be co-facilitating today with Toby, from the Consensus Building Institute. And then we're going to have our presenters on our various topics, our consultants that have really been working to help the work groups through the progress. Just one other update I want to highlight, outreach and engagement. So as everyone here knows, we've been very conscientious about going out and trying to engage broad stakeholders. Our work groups consist of, I think, several hundred people when you add up all the stakeholders. And though we're going into the community to speak with folks that don't have the time, the opportunity to participate in work groups. So we've held several community meetings. Our most recent one was in Canton. We had a really good turnout, probably about 30 folks, really good engagement, and very specific around battery energy storage and some issues, concerns, but also opportunities that people saw for it. So it was a really good engagement. We're bringing some of that back. And then I think several of you know that we here at OET co-chaired the Special Commission on Fossil Fuel Workforce with our friends at Workforce and Labor. We developed a report on that came out on December 30th that really looks at where we are in terms of energy transitioning vis-a-vis the workforce we have today and the workforce that we anticipate that we'll need, and how do we make sure that we're having a just and equitable transition and creating opportunity across the board on that. So it's a great product. I encourage everybody to take a look at it. It's on the OET website. I also want to thank my fellow commission members, some of whom are here today. I know Dan Leary's here today. I think a couple others who are maybe not here, but are coming there today that were on the commission in really solid products. So thank you to everyone participating in that. And now I'm going to turn it over to Zoe.
Great. All right. Thanks, Melissa. So we are going to start off hearing from the Decarbonizing the Peak work group. So Liz is going to come on up right now and lead us through a presentation. So we're going to hear from Liz on some modeling results, get an update on that, and then you can see a vote, so we can go to the next slide, that we're going to ask the group to engage in after we do the presentation and some Q&A. Just essentially affirming that the work to date, the modeling, right, is on the right track, and that the group is not objecting to the FOG continuing to move forward, to proceeding along these lines in developing policy-related recommendations. So, as you hear from Liz, right, keep in mind that this is what you're going to be voting on at the end. We'll have about 15 minutes of presentation and then 15 minutes of Q&A and large group discussion. All right, so come on up, Liz.
All right, great. So I'm delighted to be here for a topic. Can you hear me okay? How's that? Is that going to interfere? Okay, great. Okay, so we are at kind of the intersection between phase 2 and phase 3 of this work. And I wanted to set up by first reminding folks what the overall kind of work plan is for the Decarbonizing the Peak working group. Then I'm going to talk about some of the modeling that we performed as part of kind of wrapping up phase 2. So as a reminder for everyone, in phase 1 of the DTP working group, we really focused on, what is the role of peakers on the system today, as well as combined heat and power or CHP facilities in the state. So looking at, what they are, how they meet various system needs, and what is the impact that they have on the grid. In phase, kind of the end of phase 1 and the beginning of phase 2, we really identified what alternatives are to peaker plants today. And in phase 2 and in the last update we gave to you all, we really walked through kind of a detailed framework that we have built to assess alternatives to peaker plants along a full range of dimensions in terms of their capabilities and characteristics. So in the work that we'll provide today, we're going to talk about how we did a deep dive, a modeling deep dive to understand some of those alternatives, resource adequacy contributions. All of this will feed into phase 3, which is really implementation oriented and will include developing recommendations, both based on all of the work that we've done to date, including the modeling and including what policies and other actions to take away from the working group. So there we go. Perfect. Okay, so on the left-hand side of this figure, what we're showing is the technology assessment framework, just as a reminder that we built over the course of the summer to assess alternatives to peaker plants in Massachusetts. All of these 40 plus alternatives were evaluated across numerous different dimensions. This modeling is meant to supplement the framework assessment with a more robust assessment specifically on the ability of different types of alternative resources to provide the resource adequacy contributions that are today provided by peaker plants in Massachusetts. So the way that we pursue this is we ran a loss of load probability model to look at how different alternatives to peaker plants perform in supporting the system during the most grid constrained extreme conditions, which are sort of the critical periods in which we rely on peaker plants today. I want to emphasize before we talk through some of the highlights of the results that we do not set out to either kind of pick winners or build sort of optimal portfolios for the future. What we're looking at really is the ability of these different resources to provide the specific services that we would need from any alternative resource to a peaker plant today. Other efforts, we'll think through what the full evolution of the system might be. We started from planning scenarios that are based on the clean energy and climate plan that the Massachusetts has today. And I'll also emphasize, we're not comparing the specific costs of these alternatives, but that those types of considerations will be important when we come up with the overall recommendations. I'll also emphasize that in what we share today, we're really focused on highlights of that modeling and a couple, selected key results. We, through the framework, evaluated 40 plus technologies along different dimensions. I'm going to give you some of the examples that I think are instructive in thinking about the types of features that are going to be needed for replacements to peaker plants. Great. So the modeling asks 3 specific questions. One is, how do different peaker plants and combined heat and power plants contribute to resource adequacy in Massachusetts and in the broader New England region today? We looked both in the near term at 2030, as well as in 2040, as the grid has evolved to, support increasing electrification and integrate large amounts of renewable resources. We looked at what happens if you were to reduce and remove different types of peaker plants from the system, and what types of energy needs the system would have if those resources are not online. And then we looked at how different types of supply side and demand side resources can reduce or eliminate reliance on peaker plants. So pulling from different renewables, storage, SMRs, et cetera, basically how these different types of resources could replace the contributions that peaker plants are providing. Great. So this slide just underscores, we started from a database of all of the peaker plants in Massachusetts, and we grouped those peaker plants into different types of units, and those included large legacy units, which are typically older peaker plants, often dual fuel. Many rely on oil. These are larger plants on larger sites. We also have a second category of larger, newer units that operate more frequently. We call these the mid-merit units. And these are a mix of kind of combined cycle, and many are dual fuel. There are also a lot of smaller units. A lot of these have very low capacity factors. Many are diesel. And I'll emphasize, particularly with these units, but across all of these, I don't want to suggest that the modeling alone replaces the types of site-specific individual considerations that are going to be relevant when you think about a specific site and potentially, replacing or retiring at that specific site, given, many of the local or institutional or locational contributions that different resources provide. Great. So first, I'm going to emphasize or summarize what we identified about the system as it exists today. So this slide basically shows, what are the contributions of facilities to meeting near-term ISO New England needs. In the modeling, it demonstrated that as the ISO New England electrifies, it will remain summer peaking, certainly in 2030, and that the peaker plants are increasingly important for frequent short net load peak periods in the early evenings, particularly in the summer. So a lot of this kind of net peak period happens as solar generation declines in the late afternoon while load remains high. And so you can see here on the right, we're showing both a gross peak, and this see occurs at 4 p.m. And then you can see the net peak, and that's at 6 p.m. And you can see that renewables are significantly contributing to meeting that gross peak. But where we actually are using the peaker plants to ensure resource adequacy is later into the evening in the net peak. And that's where the kind of dark gray, almost black on the screen there shows that the peakers are ramping up and acting at full capacity to ensure resource adequacy. This summarizes the entire year. So on the previous slide, I showed you 2030 for a handful of particularly grid constrained days. Here, what we're showing is the average generation by week over the course of the year. And the things I want you to take away are one, the gas and oil peaker need is shown the top bar, and it's very small. It's used almost all the time in 2030 if we're not adding new dispatchable generation. So even as we're adding renewables, we're still relying pretty consistently on peaker generation. And we're in particular relying on it both in the summer weeks where, as I showed on the previous slide, we have high load needs in the afternoon moving into the evening. Electrified load has grown, as well as in the winter where we have grid constrained periods and increasing heat pump adoption is driving up that winter peak. And so like today, and even more so, we are relying on peakers in the winter during those grid constrained periods. Okay, great. So as we think about what would happen if we were to remove peakers from the system, this is an example scenario where what we've done is we've removed what we categorized as those legacy peaker plants from Massachusetts, specifically from the grid. This was about 1.8 gigawatts. That created a need for about 1.6 gigawatts of quote unquote perfect capacity. The difference really just being driven by the historical forced outage rates of those legacy peakers. And so that need, what we see can in part, but not entirely, be made up for with other thermal generators and peakers on the system. And that's why here on the lower right, we see a slight increase in emissions on the grid before we've replaced those peaker plants. And we see, the energy gap, as you would expect, occurs on the system in those early evenings, particularly in the summer. Now, as I mentioned, and as you saw in the pre-read, we looked at a diverse portfolio and many different scenarios of what different replacement options could be, or what new additions we might add to the grid. And I'll emphasize, and we talked about this a lot in the working group, this is above and beyond many of the resources that we're, including 20 plus gigawatts of renewables, that we're adding to meet growing load and growing peak load in 2020. So you can see here, we looked at some of the highlighted ones, are both storage, load management. This is particularly focused on active load management, including shed demand response and flexible electrification, flexible electric vehicles. We also looked at renewables and then combinations of solar and storage. Can't go through all of this here, but what I did want to emphasize is what we saw is certainly in the near term, storage is able to replace a lot of the needs that removing peakers would create. And you can see here, so in these scenarios, we added 2 gigawatts of storage. We could reduce, anywhere between, 1 to 2 gigawatts of peakers and maintain resource adequacy in our modeled scenarios. Now, renewables by themselves were not particularly effective at significant retirements of peaker plants, but when combined with storage, we're more effective and more able to replace some of those operations. Now, I'm going to jump and give a couple of highlights from the 2040 work and then summarize and can talk through questions. So this modeling shows a set of example grid constrained days in 2040. What we see here is that, by 2040, first of all, peak demand has grown, quite different and quite a bit from today. So the peak demand in 2044 across the median peak was 44 gigawatts, and it was a winter peaking system in the scenario that we're looking at, which is based on electrification as it might proceed to meet deep decarbonization targets. And what we see is that the peakers that we have on our system were essential for continuing to meet resource adequacy requirements on the grid. And in fact, we had to add a little bit of firm capacity in order to ensure ongoing resource adequacy, while also adding 50+ gigawatts of renewables to the system. The role that peaker plants are playing was longer than it is today. So we see these extended periods of high net load during times of low renewable output. And this occurred increasingly, despite the fact that overall grid emissions falls dramatically over the course of the year, and overall thermal output was falling, as you'd expect, dramatically over the course of the year because of those renewable additions. I'll note that we saw both evening and morning net peaks, and you can see some examples here. So in that evening net peak, the gross peak is much higher. Renewables and storage, plus everything else on the grid is operating essentially at full capacity. But there is still quite a bit, to meet that net peak after you remove the output from renewables, you're still using both your legacy peakers and all the rest of the peakers and gas generation you have at essentially full capacity. In the morning net peak, when the renewable generation was lower, again, you're still using everything you have to ensure ongoing resource adequacy. And so these are the types of needs of the system that any replacement alternative needed to serve in the model. So I'm just going to give you one example from that work. And again, there is much more within the FOG working group materials as well as in the pre-read for today. So this is an example that looks at offshore wind and then offshore wind combined with long duration storage. And what you see is that, because the system already has so much renewables on it, the incremental ability of additional offshore wind. So in this case, the system had 15 gigawatts of offshore wind and the peakers to meet that growing load and growing peak load. Incremental offshore wind beyond that was by itself not very effective at reducing peaker need, but only in combination with additional storage resources was able to replace. And in this case, actually, I'll flag that because of the extended duration of the need, it really needed to be long duration storage to effectively ensure ongoing resource adequacy. And in fact, these numbers are quite large. We didn't put dollar signs associated with them, but as you can imagine, it's quite expensive relative to today, and something that the working group is thinking about. But show that in combination, these resources. Now, I'm just going to wrap. I think this slide kind of summarizes all of the points we've already talked about so far, but I'll emphasize, the working group focused first on 2030 and, identified that peakers are really focused, supporting and critical at supporting these net peaks in the evening, in the summers. They're short duration, typically 2 to 4 hours, and a range of resources was pretty effective actually at meeting a lot of the needs of the Massachusetts peakers, as well as other peakers throughout New England, ramping up to ensure ongoing resource adequacy. In the longer term, as the role of peaker generations changes, right? And so anything that replaces peaker generation today is going to have to support critical periods that are in the winter evenings and extend often into winter mornings or reemerge in the early mornings. And we found that those periods that any replacement alternative needs to be able to support were both increasing in duration and in variability. So they're not as predictable as they are in 2030. I'll also flag that the existing peaker capacity was fully utilized in those scenarios, and in fact needed more of them in order to ensure resource adequacy if you're not going to add more than 50 gigawatts renewables. And again, that had implications for the types of resources that were best equipped to replace those services. I'm gonna pause there and open it up for any clarifying questions or questions around how this is being used by the working group or anything.
Great, thanks so much, Liz. Let's see who has a question or comment. Okay, great.
Paul, and that should be us, Jose, and me.
Great.
Okay, I have a quick question and then a comment on items. So coming again. So one of the questions I have is how how do we model anomalous, infrequent, multi-day weather patterns where renewables aren't readily available or putting out very high contribution? And then the second, the comment is, as you look at the cost piece, since the goal is decarbonizing, it would be very helpful if you compare different options based on dollars per avoided ton of CO2, since that's the goal, right? And so we want to meet the goal at the least cost, and that just seems like a reasonable metric.
Great, so I'll comment on I'll comment on both of those. One is we ran a loss of load probability model that essentially takes recent history for loads and renewable outputs for the resources that we have, matches those, and then simulates the system over thousands of weather conditions, looking at weather over the last 40 years. It says if weather looks like it has over the last 40 years, we can predict essentially what load and renewable output would look like under those conditions and identify those extreme conditions. Under those extreme conditions, we're looking at, with the portfolio do we have, what do we expect renewables to generate? Obviously, in 2040, the most critical periods are going to be the low renewable output, high load conditions. So there we're looking at, the model is looking, was there enough generation the week before for resources on average to charge from so that they could discharge during those periods? Or does the resource have kind of the dispatchability characteristics that would enable it to dispatch without concerns for weather? I think that's why we get the types of results we get.
4 years, only 4 years?
40.
Yeah,
Yes.
sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
It's for the last 4 years. Yes. Yeah. But then we run a Monte Carlo simulation that draws them in different orders and combinations in order to reflect like what the system would look like to get that 1 day and 10-year statistic. And then your second point around costs. So there are other efforts at EEA to think through what a least cost portfolio subject to constraints will look like over the coming 3 decades. This is definitely much more narrowly focused. That said, I'll just comment a few things. One is that we can think about for these specific portfolios what the dollar per ton was of these different alternatives. These are kind of last mile alternatives too. That's the second point I want to make, right? Is that you're decarbonizing many non-peak hours, and those are going to be the lower dollar per ton cost to decarbonize, right? Those are going to be the hours in which renewables are abundant. The peak hours are going to be the highest dollar per ton marginal cost to reduce the peak. And I think that's an important point, and I really appreciate your feedback there. It's something that we're thinking about.
Yeah, well, that is something the work group has talked about. So we talked about phasing it. First, let's look at it, what the system would look like and what it would look like. Then we can start talking about cost base, and also as we move into the policy discussion, which is going to come forward, the takeaways from this saying, what do we need? What are the resources we need? So what would be the policies that we should be looking at? And then one of the biggest policies we're looking at as a group is how do we actually just mitigate whatever that demand is? So this is where I think some of the demand side is going to work that PUER has been doing out there. We'll be able to bring those two things together so that we can optimize that.
Thanks. Where was Jose?
Right in front of you. My question is very well, 2 questions. One, how does this model compare to ICE?
I mean, they run their own, resource adequacy models. I think they are very similar, right? The ELCC curves, for example, we get out of our model look a lot like the models that ISO gets. Now, we ran 2 specific years and 2 specific portfolios and sets of assumptions. And I think the ability of, for example, storage to support resource adequacy needs is going to be largely a function of how much renewables we can build out and how fast. So I think that is probably one place in which they're different.
And have they had input or seen this as well, Melissa?
Yeah, not directly. They do know our ongoing effort, and we've engaged them, but
I just think that the knowledge they have in this area.
Yeah.
Their input would be very helpful, understanding from the technical side, it's our knowledge, technical side. Then my other question was really around what Paul said, because reading the NBCC report, that came out a year ago, where they actually looked at one of the storms we had about less than 20 years ago. It showed offshore wind stopped, and it would not have been able to then charge batteries enough to the point that they would pick up at one of the storms. So just curious how that came in the model.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we didn't look at specific historical events, but I do think a clear finding in the modeling was a lot of the ability of batteries is going to be contingent and having a lot of for sure. So having them around, having the right timing. It's hard to compare a specific event to like the specific set of scenarios we ran, but I think it's good feedback. Well,
You see.
Great, I see a couple hands. We'll go to, why don't we take a couple at once, just so we can have more voices. Go ahead, Steve.
And
Okay.
Toby, could I ask for folks in the room to identify their affiliation for us online since we can't see?
Great, thanks, Catherine. Yeah.
Okay, just very quickly,
Steve, identify yourself.
Steve Powell, Director of Northeast Energy Efficiency Electrification Council. And the charts were great, they were very detailed, very looking. I guess the two questions that jumped out in my brain in terms of where and how deep the analysis has been on what can be achieved through time of use rates and part of that is EV charging. We had the analysis group doing a study a few years ago that having a time of use charging versus whenever you come home is a 400% difference on the peak impact, right? And so one of the real questions is how deep the analysis needs to be, can be, and when it can be on how much time of use can have the impact. I haven't seen it on the charts, probably because the analysis is still a work in progress. And also on storage, how deep the analysis is so far and how much we have to dive to see what kind of storage, where, when, and how. Those are the two things that jump out at me, particularly the time of use management. I know we're still working on it. So where are we going to go and how quickly?
Thanks, Steve. So I want to ask, just put a pin in that. We're going to take a couple. You got your hands up, sir. Introduce yourself.
Hi, Kyle Murray from Acadia Center. In the same vein of modeling incidents where renewables aren't producing at full capacity, did we model incidents where gas generation capacity is failed as well? Because we have seen some of those incidents pop up over the years as well.
Great. And then I saw Hudson. He'll be the last question here. Then we'll turn it back to Liz.
Very sorry.
Hudson Gilmer, board chair of Line Vision. So you talk about batteries and storage, and I think what kind of assumptions we make around that are really critical. Just because it's been moving so fast. I was looking at a statistic that said in California, grid scale storage increased 20x from 2020 to 2024. And in all capacity additions last year, 80% of the capacity was solar plus storage. And so, as we look forward, I just want to make sure we're not kind of biased to the existing state of things and maybe even doing sensitivity analysis to high intensity of battery.
Great. So yeah, Liz, a couple of questions on sort of granularity, sensitivity analysis on time of use, EV charging. Okay, one more. Okay, there you go.
There is a question online. I am Mika from the McKinsey Global Institute. I guess one process question and then one substantive question. Just so this is great analysis and really exciting to see this come together. What wasn't entirely clear to me and maybe relevant as we think about the vote is the rubrics that you shared on your first slide, which was, here's 40 technologies evaluated against a whole host of measures, which included things like cost and technological maturity. It doesn't seem like we've thought about that as yet. So just from a process standpoint, when does that come into the analysis? And does that need to happen before the policy recommendation? So that's one kind of question. The other is maybe just a suggestion as we think about policy recommendations. I think what a lot of what the group is suggesting or is alluding to is there are a lot of uncertainties associated with this analysis, right? You mentioned yourself a few times, this is all subject to X gigawatts of renewables actually coming online. It's subject to what our expectations of cost declines are. It's subject to what types of weather events we're modeling. So I think just as we think about the policy recommendations down the road, just how robust those recommendations are to those uncertainties, maybe something, a sort of criteria.
I do think I see Liz taking notes, so you'll be ready to address all of these, but let's go online since I do see a hand there.
Yeah, you have a question from Murray.
Murray. Okay, go ahead, Murray.
Yeah, I will say I feels like the questions are adding up and it feels like we're going to lose track of them in trying to address all of them at once. But I have less of a question and more of a comment as a member of the Decarbonizing the Peak working group. I feel like in sharing information back for the advisory board to have a sense of what we've been up to and vote on proceeding should include two other parts of the conversation that have felt important, at least to me as a member of the group. One of which is the panel that we had that we invited the whole advisory board to recently to hear about community impacts and how that pertains to all of this. You know, any alternative we consider definitely has impacts on communities, and making sure we're taking that into account in decisions as we move forward in in policies, et cetera, feels really important. And the other piece is that several members of the Decarbonizing the Peak working group commissioned a study that's kind of parallel to this one that Synapse worked on, outlining how the state could meet peak demand by 2050 with renewables and storage. And that was shared out with the working group and feels like it might be helpful to share out to the whole advisory board just so folks know what we've been discussing and going over as different data points, because the two modeling pieces are I would say parallel to each other, in some ways overlap, in some ways don't. And that's been a key part of the conversation that we've been having that feels like it's worth mentioning to the full board that's going to be voting on our progress.
Thanks, Murray. Liz, I've got notes in case you're having trouble keeping track, but I'll hand it over to you.
Let me answer as many as I think I remember. So the first thing was about rate design and time of use rates and their implications on the load shape and on the peak load that needs to be met. I'll say a couple of things there. One is that some degree of managed charging and aggregation and smoothing of load is already assumed in the load shape of the model. So certainly something that has been considered out, prior to, basically as a first step before we, are dispatching the renewables to meet that growing load. In addition to that, we ran some scenarios looking specifically at load management features of the grid, particularly these active load management. So things like moving around charging load to ensure that it's, smoothed out over the course of the evening, and not just a TOU rate, but something that actually smoothed it so you don't get a huge rebound peak. And certainly as part of the load management study that was also done by DOER, I think that study really got into that particular issue in detail, and we pulled a lot of those findings and assumptions into the modeling that we did. I will also say that I think in this next phase of work where we're focused on actions and policy recommendations, things like rate design, I think will be very relevant there in terms of how do we achieve the futures that we're looking at in a way that's cost effective. So appreciate the feedback, and it will continue, I think, to come up as we think through recommendations. The second question was around how we think about the performance of other natural gas units or peaker plants in terms of forced outage rates. So we do the best we can for this particular modeling exercise. And what we do is we looked at the reported forced outage rates over the course of the last several years. And we assume those forced outage rates in the modeling, we've done it multiple ways. We've assumed they happen randomly. And so that has implications for what we get in terms of the ELCC for different types of peaker plants and different types of units. We can also add a shape to those forced outage rates and say if those forced outage rates are more likely to occur during times where we think the grid is constrained, we can look at how that might have implications for their performance. And obviously their performance influences how much of a resource you would need to replace it because it sort of how good they are. There was another question around what we thought about sort of levels of renewables and storage on the grid. And did we look at different levels of renewables and storage? We're somewhat constrained for this study, right? We could run infinite combinations of renewable energy and storage. What we do is assume, I think, pretty ambitious achievement of renewable energy build out and storage build out, even in 2030. So, and we assume, for example, that all of the storage procurements, all of that is online and operational in our model by 2030, as well as about 20 gigawatts of renewable energy throughout New England. So, that I think actually gives storage, frankly, like its best shot at replacing the operations of peaker plants. That said, I do think, other initiatives, other modeling, even this could explore that in a lot more detail because I agree that it's a kind of critical assumption for what you find. The next question I think was about how we use the broader framework. I do want to emphasize that this is one piece of a broader framework and we cannot think about, let me say it is a necessary but not sufficient condition for reducing reliance on peaker plants. Attaining a loss of load probability of less than 1 day in every 10 years is sort of a prerequisite, I think, for the grid. It's something that we assume, continues to be in place into the future. That said, there are all sorts of other considerations, as you saw, community, environment, jobs, economic, all of those are also important, in some sense, also, necessary conditions for thinking about reducing reliance on peaker plants. And has been where we've gotten really diverse and broad, important contributions, I think, from the working group and will be central to the recommendations I'd say that come out. I think those are the big questions.
Yeah, the only thing I want to just sort of add to what Liz said is just to put everything in context, because I think she did a great job writing the overview and contextualizing this. Just the modeling is directional. So I just want to also manage expectations. We're not going to get a perfect model, and we're not going to do 1,000 scenarios. One, we don't have the budget to do that. We don't, and I don't think that's necessary because we can keep doing scenarios. I think what we're trying to do in this is more directional, right? A directional understanding of where we are, of where we think the system's going to be, of what the resources are today that's meeting our need, of what the resources would need to be in the future to meet the need that we think we're going to have, and then using that, right, to help us as we go to policy to say, if we want a system that is less reliant on peaker plants, then what do we need to do? What are the attributes of the replacement resources? How would they need to be used in combination? And so therefore, if we want them, then what are the policies that we should be starting to put in place today to think through to actually get to where we want to go? So think about the modeling in that context, right? Is it providing us with information to help have those kinds of conversations in a box, right? Because we can have the conversations really widely, but we need something to actually help us, right? Bring them to a more manageable place where we can then really understand what trade-offs are and what combination of policy recommendations could be to do both things, both reduce that peak and then meet the peak in a way that's more sustainable and that helps us towards our decarbonization goals. So I really want to sort of contextualize what the modeling is and set expectations. We are not going to be able to model, thousands of scenarios.
Thanks so much. And I do just want to make sure that last comment from Hooray is not lost in this as well. There was this community impacts forum that the Decarbonizing the Peak group hosted. I know a number of the folks in this room were there. And so when we do get to the vote and we're talking about the work that group has done to date and whether that is a sufficient basis for you all to vote for them continuing, that obviously is included, right, in that work, an important component. I don't know if there's anything either one you want to say about the Synapse study that was raised.
So we did, Murray mentioned Synapse did a presentation on a study around, decarbonizing the peak as well, looking at potential for replacement alternatives. And I think as Marie said, right, there are some similarities, some differences, but we can use both of that modeling information as we move into a phase around policies, because again, they're directionally similar. They might have different nuances, but again, I think it provides us with different grounding to sort of say, okay, we understand the need and we understand where we think we need to go. Now the question is, what do you need to replace to maybe try to get there?
Thanks. Okay, so I see we have a couple hands online. Just for time, unfortunately, we're going to have to press forward, but please, if you have additional comments, follow up with us. We want to hear what they are and want your input. But we do need to go to a vote so we can have time for some of the other groups as well. So here is the vote that was sent around in advance. You can see the text there. The advisory board affirms the FOG's assessment and modeling approach to date and supports the FOG proceeding to phase 3 to develop policy-focused recommendations. So essentially, this is an affirmation of the work you're seeing. A go ahead to continue into phase 3.
Caveats that we've reviewed it, that we're going to be taking all this into consideration, and we will do the best we can on cost.
Yes.
As we do.
Right. This includes the comments and suggestions made in the room today. And on. So with that, we're going to start in the room. Could we see a hand of all in favor of this? Okay, great. All opposed? Okay, see one opposition. Yeah. Okay. Any abstain? Okay. 2 abstains. Okay. And looking online, we're not going to ask for folks who are in favor. We're just going to do opposed and abstaining. Okay, just for ease of handwritten. So we're going to ask you to raise your virtual hands. And Catherine, you have a good view of folks online. So we'll ask you to take a look at this. If you are opposed, please raise your hand.
So Mary, did you intend your hand to go up for opposition? Just to be clear. No.
Okay.
So.
All right, so no hands. And abstaining, anyone online? Okay, yeah. We have Lorraine abstaining. 2. Okay, great. 2 abstaining. Okay, so it does move forward. For those of you who oppose or have abstentions, we really do welcome you to follow up with us, so we can clarify what those are about and see what we can be doing to address them. All right, so with that, we're going to move to our next FOG. We're going to hear from Mike from Groundwork Data to present on the EMT FOG. So you can go to the next slide. We are going to hear presentation on some findings and recommendations that are being provided to the utilities for an upcoming filing. So we'll hear a little bit about that timeline and what the content is. And then we're going to have a vote similar to what we just had on whether you affirm what it's doing and are good with them moving forward. So with that, I'll hand it over to Mike.
Thanks, Toby. So behind me, one or two of you might notice there's a big ship leaving the Mystic right now. Or that's not an LNG tank. Right? Real interesting stuff that's going to be on my slides. So, thanks for the introduction, Toby. There are 3 things that I want to go over here today. I want you to take away from this presentation. First, we've made substantial progress on our findings and recommendations. We're approaching the finish line with our work. These draft findings and recommendations and summaries of the utilities EMT alternative assessments were distributed in your pre-reading materials. Second, you'll hear that we've been wrestling with some challenging questions. There's no magic solution here, and only the recognition that our energy system is transformed, just as it has been since EMT was built in 1970. What's different now is that to achieve our climate and affordability goals, we need to coordinate the collective action problems, manage the transition, and deliver. Third, we're asking you to affirm that our draft findings and recommendations represent sufficient progress. That affirmation will enable us to continue refining them and hone our recommendations into something actionable by June. We've come a long way since fall 2024. In phase 1, we focused on understanding EMT's role, what it does, uses it, and why it matters. In phase 2, we informed and received the gas company's alternative assessments. Now in phase 3, we're focused on producing findings and recommendations. And again, by the June ETAB meeting, we'll deliver a final report with final recommendations for your consideration. To ensure that goes smoothly, we wanted to share our draft findings and recommendations here today to get your input and ensure that we're on the right track. Let me start with where EMT fits into the system. At the last ETAB meeting, I presented on how EMT supports the gas utilities through a cold snap, not that different from the one that we just passed through last. EMT isn't just a source of gas molecules. It's an asset that provides 5 distinct services: vapor supply and pipelines, liquid supply via trucks, pressure support, system redundancy, and energy storage for the entire world. These services benefit parties that go beyond gas utilities at contracts. Our working group debated about whether EMT is necessary for electric grid reliability. Currently, some generators, such as those shaded in circles on the map, can purchase gas on the spot market EMT, benefiting from its presence, but paying less than for services in the gas utilities. ISO New England has said there's no clear quantitative evidence that EMT is essential, but they've also urged the region to retain it and cited qualitative reliability benefits. We also know that region-wide firm gas storage resources can play a complementary role to the variable clean energy and electric heating resources that are the foundation of our climate strategy. The honest answer for the grid is EMT is helpful, and removing it introduces uncertainties that we don't believe in. What's less debatable is the gas utility situation. For the utility serving Metro Boston's inner core, EMT is an option. It's how they maintain system pressure and provide backup during pipeline outages. We did not find a feasible pathway for them to operate reliability without EMT by 2030. And here's the key issue. EMT provides regional reliability services, but it doesn't receive consummate compensation for those broader benefits. The gas utilities pay for supply, the reliability value flows to others who don't pay for it. So EMT plays a real role, but that role is changing, and this is where things get complicated. The challenge of EMT is that a challenge we face as we enter the middle part of our energy transition, where legacy assets like EMT exist in an uncomfortable limbo. They were built for a previous era, evolved as demands change, but are still needed by a cleaner energy system that's still in its infancy. The challenge of the mid-transition space can be illustrated by 3 key tensions that EMT faces. Let's start with costs. EMT's costs are largely fixed. The revenue needed to keep it operational doesn't change much whether it's used heavily or lightly. After Mystic closed, those costs shifted almost entirely to gas rate payment. That's a smaller group using the facility less frequently, paying more per unit of energy delivered. They feel these costs more acutely. Second, emissions. Now here's some important nuance to EMT. EMT's direct emissions impact is small. It's about 0.25% of the Commonwealth's greenhouse gas emissions in 2020. As a peak resource, it's actually consistent with the kind of residual gas use contemplated in the 2050 decarbonization roadmap. However, and this is the important tension that we're dealing with, the gas companies' demand forecasts that underpin EMT reliance assume total peak and non-peak consumption levels that will exceed our 2030 emissions levels. So the greenhouse gas issue isn't EMT itself, it's the broader demand trajectory that exists. Third, the future is uncertain. EMT is simultaneously supporting the end intention with the clean energy transition. Energy storage, as we just heard, will be foundational as we decarbonize, and EMT is the largest energy storage asset in state record, strategically located with the gas system. But it's fossil infrastructure. Its role will evolve as heating electrifies and the grid changes. We need to build optionality around it, not block ourselves into dependence or premature closure. This mid-transition problem creates risks that we need to manage. I won't belabor each of these, but I want to name them because they inform our recommendations. First off, changing demand risk. Electrification will reduce gas demand. The timing of this is uncertain. Meanwhile, electricity demand would grow, which would actually increase EMT's potential value to generators. Economic risk. Last week, the DPU approved Eversource's proposed pipeline contract that would eliminate their need for EMT supply in southeastern Massachusetts. In 2030, their ratepayers will stop contributing to EMT's fixed costs, and those costs will shift to the remaining LDC customers. This is good for Eversource ratepayers, but potentially challenging for national grid ratepayers. This cost-shifting dynamic is something that we need to address. Regulatory transition. State policy is pushing away from fossil fuel infrastructure while reliability requirements demand we maintain at high accuracy. These objectives are intentional. Situational. EMT sits in an environmental justice community that's hosted regional infrastructure for decades. There's real community and workforce implications here. These risks can be mitigated only through deliberate actions to shape customer demand and system operations, which brings us to our steps forward. EMT is a shared resource with shared benefits, but the cost and decisions are fragmented across multiple parties with different interests. Does that sound familiar to you all? It's structurally similar to climate change, right? Everyone benefits from the solution, but there's no single actor that can solve it. Individual incentives don't align with collective outcomes. One utility's rational decision on EMT creates cost burdens for others. And there's real conflict we have to recognize. There are risks to remaining heavily reliant on EMT, cost exposure, potential stranded investment, continued loss of field dependence, and there are risks to moving away from EMT. Reliability concerns, cost shifts, losing optionality before alternatives are ready. We can't ignore this tension, we gotta manage it. Our finding is clear. It's highly unlikely that sufficient demand reduction and system investments can be deployed by 2030 to eliminate LDC reliance, gas utility reliance on EMT. But prioritizing these strategies now can reduce the risks and costs associated with EMT. This is where integrated energy planning comes in. Emerging as an element of the electric sector modernization plans, its goal is to optimize across historically siloed systems, gas, electric, demand-side options. It's a nascent practice, still being defined, but it's conceptually the mechanism we need to solve this collection action problem. Coordinated investments, aligning incentives, and making system-wide decisions rather than piecemeal ones. This framing directly leads to our first recommendation. Incorporate EMT dependency considerations into integrated energy planning, with demand reduction as the primary strategy. Demand reduction here is foundational because it addresses both the supply question and the reliability question. If you reduce peak gas demand in EMT-dependent areas, you reduce the quantity of supply needed and reducing operational stress that creates reliability risk. The commercial industrial sector is the priority target here. With concentrated demand, expressed interest in decarbonization from some of our higher education institutions, high potential for efficiency electrification. Residential matters too, but it's where we found that C&I can have the biggest impact. The sub-recommendations here operationalize these goals. Develop metrics and reporting, consider targeted system investments for cost effective, ensure Everett residents and businesses who've hosted this facility for decades receive consideration for beneficial IoT opportunities. Recommendations 2 and 3 address the cost and longer term questions that exist. Recommendation 2 is about cost fairness. If the LDC's utilization patterns diverge, as they may with the Eversource G lateral situation I mentioned earlier, we need policy mechanisms to prevent disproportionate cost burdens from falling on a shrinking set of ratepayers. This requires work beyond the gas company's direct control. The FOG recommends that the state actively explore these mechanisms. Recommendation 3 acknowledges what we don't know. EMT is the largest energy storage asset in the state. What role should gas storage play over the next 10 to 30 years as we decarbonize? Existing studies are helpful, but are limited in scope. We recommend additional analysis by the 2030 contract renewal. On timeline, the FOG continues to meet through the spring. We'll consider your feedback in February. The LDCs will present their annual reports in early March. We will work on cost mitigation strategies in March as well. Final findings and recommendations will come to you in June. These are drafts right now. We're asking the advisory board, you all here, to affirm that they represent sufficient progress and merit continued refinement. But before we dive into that, we're happy to answer any questions that you might have on this. Thank you.
And we also have several members of the working group, actually, that are here today too. They can also answer questions.
Great. All right, thanks. So yeah, let's see. Just like to get a sense in the room of how many folks think they might want to ask a question. Okay, let's see a couple again. So we'll do a couple at once, not 5 like last time, but we'll get a couple at once.
And you have one online as well, Toby.
Great, thank you. Hi, this is Bob Everett from the When we talk about planning pathways, we talk about integrated electric planning. This goes back to a question that actually came over today. Have we thought about what the levelized or the marginal cost of abatement would be to electrify certain portions of the system? And if so, how would that weigh in the decision to change how we're dealing with EM? Right? And it goes back to, I think, another question that I had a little bit earlier, which is if we're going to look at the levelized cost of abatement and we're going to effectively prioritize alternatives,
with reference to or by reference to the marginal cost, is there some cost that's simply too high? Is there some level of levelized cost per ton that while it may be reasonable relative to another alternative in some other sense by reference to some other metric simply is too high?
And I saw a hand, you sir?
Hi, Dan Dolan, New England Power Generators Association. Thank you for this. This is very helpful. I am curious though, as we think about the combination of the recommendation to focus on CNI, with then also the recognition that if you have a dwindling customer base, concentrate particularly those fixed costs, and how do you reconcile that tension, given that CNI is kind of that largest payer and user, particularly when we think about that as a large fixed asset, there's a step change issue that sure reduction helps volumetrically, but it actually concentrates more costs and risks on that fixed side if you're not able to recover them on the marginal sales that go forward. So any further thought on how you square those two elements, which I think in isolation are laudable, but seem to be intentional?
We'll pause there and like take those two and then get to some others.
Well, I think that's what I'm paying attention, right? And that's what we're navigating the whole process here. It's something that we're going to continue to wrestle with once as we look at opportunities to share the cost burden and as a partner, it's out there on things to people. While at the same time, getting clarity, I think, on that trajectory of where certain safety and I customers are. One of the things that we heard from, we did invite a large CMI consortium to the table here and expressed interest in a very large integrated planning effort to do a sort of network district system here basically in Boston, right? And those universities and other Pog institutions are investigating that, have expressed that. And that's sort of prerogative to move forward with that, right? And so it's kind of acting that all together, really trying to understand, okay, where are the key sort of opportunities to recognizing there's a big step change, but are there smart, incremental opportunities that we can take to kind of provide optionality across the system? One of the things that our work group also expanded the conversation around was energy efficiencies popped up as an option, demand response, electrification, sort of traditional things. But we're actually starting to talk about leveraging some oil assets that might be used still to ensure and give additional optionality around DT. And those assets might be at a lower marginal cost than continue relying on DT. So there's a lot of things out there, but that big step change, I think you're identifying is, I think, the really big tension point in that element that we're advocating.
And I'll just add to Dan, your question and Bob yours, I think they're very aligned. Sort of take a step back. We are on a trajectory, right, around decarbonization. We've got customers that are moving that way, right, and that they're changing their outlook, they're changing what they're doing. We've got our state mandates that we're moving to, right? We have policies underway, so we're moving in that direction. So these are your questions are right on. How do we do it most effectively and cost effectively? And I think that's why you see we have recommendation 1, which is we think as a working group, the way we're going to reduce our reliance on Everett is by accelerating demand reduction. And we need to, as we do that, think through recommendation 2, which was how do we then address the cost issue? So they're not separate, they're parallel. And we're going to need organizations like yours at the table to have that conversation.
There was a question online. So I think, I see Larry and Tina. We'll go to Larry first.
And if folks online could also identify yourself as well.
Sure. Hi, this is Larry Cretion, Green Energy Consumers Alliance. Myself and Carrie Catan, who works with me, just put some time into the fog. If you could show slide 23 for a second, I'd appreciate it. I guess I want to say the same thing I said the last time we were had a vote on a check on this fog. I can vote to move it forward. I'm not convinced I'm going to vote to support all the recommendations at the very end of the process. I'll be honest with you, I haven't seen, I've learned a lot about the complexity of EMT and the gas system and all that, and I appreciate that. I think it's very valuable to do that. But I'm not seeing a lot of energy transformation here. It seems to me it's a check a bit on why we might need EMT for 5 years. I think when you get into 2040, et cetera, you're talking speculation. But the reason I asked for slide 23 to be up is the look at number 6. EMT is a minor greenhouse gas impact. That was educational. But the LDC demand forecast driving its use assume consumption that exceed 2030 emission sublimits. And I think we should have spent more time on that one. I really find that to be a disputable statement. The LDCs are expecting demand to increase when in fact gas demand in the Commonwealth has been falling for years. We try to put that into the record. And if with electrification, it should continue to fall. We've got building performance standards in Boston and in Cambridge. We have 10 communities that have all electric new construction ordinances. And we're seeing opportunities there that ought to be considered that are as important in the planning of not just EMT, but the gas infrastructure throughout the entire state. And just a reminder, I'm like, how can we plan on exceeding 2030 emission sublimits? That's against the law. And so I think there should have been more effort at trying to figure out how we reconcile not just EMT, but the gas infrastructure with what's still on the books, folks, is the Global Warming Solution Act with the subsequent emission sublimits. So that's what I'm going to be looking forward to in the next couple of months as this winds down. Thanks.
Well, I appreciate that. And I think just kind of in response, I think that's why when we're looking at recommendation 1, how do we accelerate the demand reduction and kind of looking at big chunks of customers and how can we accelerate the reduction in their gas use. So I think that's spot on, and that's exactly why I think we're gonna have to spend a lot of time in that in the next couple months.
Thanks. Let's take we'll go 2 more online.
Yeah, Tina Bennett.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Tina Bennett, Power Options. We have a lot of members bearing the cost of the EMT, so I really appreciate all the work done. And what struck me was, a few customers paying for a lot, and a lot of the ancillary benefits of having EMT available in the marketplace. So my question is more one of curious and how the group is thinking about not only planning for the future in terms of getting off it and how we might need the unit transitionally and how we share those costs, but even in the moment, I'm not privy to the agreement between the utilities and EMT, but is there a cost? Is there a savings mechanism such that when it's used for other things, for reliability, for electric supply, etc., that some of the sort of market mechanism, as a market mechanism in the contract, is there a way of getting shared savings from the fact that they're bearing the majority of the fixed costs? So when the market peaks and the supply costs go up, do the LDC customers receive a benefit from the other uses of the facility, I guess is what I'm asking.
Great, thanks. Mary, we'll give you a chance to ask your question, and we'll turn it back to Mike.
So mine is not a question, it's just a comment after reading the recommendations when they were sent. I'm disturbed that there's a recognition of an environmental justice community, but without any redress. So that really concerns me. The assumption that there are elevated considerations for beneficial IEP opportunities, which environmental justice advocates have said again and again that there are a lot of procedural barriers that make it difficult. So saying that, Everett will have a say in the IEP is not sufficient. And then I'm also concerned that there's actually no timeline. There's no timeline identified of closure, and that concerns me. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina and Mary, for those, and I'll just take them one by one. Tina, the topic of our next two meetings is going to be this question of how do we better manage that cost allocation burden that's there. And we have some ideas that we're going to bring to the table to the FOG, and we're going to ask our FOG members, and we invite you all to bring any ideas that you might have around that, either directly to us or to your representatives on the FOG. So please push any ideas forward on that. We do want to dive into that topic very much so. And on the question of environmental justice, okay, thank you, Tina. And on the question of environmental justice in African communities, and we, I think, recognize that integrated energy planning is an emerging space. There's some early work and early conversations right now around how to do it. We're identifying some, I think, very unique opportunities for going after certain neighborhoods or housing complexes in the sort of low to moderate income sphere in the IEP realm as well. So that's one thing that's top of our mind, but it is something that we can bring up in discussion, particularly as it relates to EMT, as we refine these recommendations.
Yeah, and Mary, I think, the recommendation one where we're going to look at accelerating demand reduction. Well, we're going to be looking at some of the larger institutions to really take chunks out of the gas demand. We're also going to be looking at ways to better target resources to help also transition at the community level. And so I think that's where we're going to have a lot of focus over the course of the next 12 months. And so, having your participation, others, I know, John Walkie and his team are involved as well. So I think we're going to, that's going to be really important. That's what we're going to do.
Okay, so I want to note the secretary is here. So I know there's some folks who've been waiting patiently kind of in the room, but I ask if we could just, if you had your hand up from the beginning, I'll let you take a quick remark, but then we want to grab this, okay?
Yeah, just Hudson Gilmer again with Land Vision. So I very much support the core recommendation of accelerating energy demand. I guess the question is, has there also in parallel been an attempt to build a phased roadmap of how do you reduce the infrastructure as that demand reduces? So for example, when can you shut down Green Terminal? When can you replace that with just storage and compressors and reduce the cost of that sense that is that part of the next phase?
Yeah, I think that gets sort of the third recommendation. That piece of it is as we're doing demand reduction, what are we putting in place to mitigate risk of, let's say, EMT does just close out in a decade. What else do we need to put in place to make sure that we can serve the customers, as we continue to transition to gas? So that will be part of what we're trying to capture in recommendation 3.
Okay. Great, thanks. And additional feedback, of course, we know we have a limited discussion time here. Feel free to share it in writing. We are going to go to our vote now. And then just FYI, we're going to, since the secretary is here, give her a chance to offer her remarks, and then we'll do our break after that. Okay. So you see here a multi-pronged vote. These are just essentially different pieces of approving the FOG and its current trajectory to continue along this path of evaluation and developing findings and recommendations. So the first is essentially saying that the findings and recommendation pathway are sufficient for additional deliberation on these recommendations, including around implementation. The next bullet relates to an upcoming filing deadline where the utilities or the LDCs are going to be filing an update on their EMT progress to DPU April 1st. So we want to have these initial preliminary finding recommendations in front of them if they do that. And then third and finally, that these findings and recommendations are essentially approved to be provided at the next, the advisory board approves the continued development of this for a discussion at the next ETAB meeting. So like they will continue developing these and then you'll be voting on them at the next ETAB. So the process essentially.
So basically, we'll be looking to kind of wrap up the work on Everett by the next meeting.
Yeah.
If we're not gonna make that, we'll let folks know, but that would be the intent. So for those who work, it'll be a lot of work between now and then, but that would be our.
Okay, so we're gonna do a single vote on these three. We're not gonna do them independently. Okay. So all in favor in the room, raise your hands. Okay. 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 All opposed? Okay. Okay. Abstaining? So we have one opposed. I see two abstaining in the room. Online, we're just going to start with opposed. Any opposed? Okay. Okay. See 3 hands online. Okay, thank you. And abstaining? Okay, no abstentions online. Okay, so again, encourage you please to reach out with your concerns if they haven't been adequately expressed in the room already. We want to hear those and see how we can address them. With that, we're going to move to the next item in our agenda. So we have Secretary Tepper here, who's going to offer some remarks, some updates for us. And after this, we'll then go to break. So Secretary Tepper, welcome. Thanks so much for being here. The floor is yours.
I'm standing in between your break time, but I also saw that Brad Campbell had his hand up for a question. Where is he? I just saw. Oh yeah, there you are. Do you want to ask your question?
No, that's okay.
You had it up for a while, and I was like, oh no, he's not getting his question answered.
I'll be heard.
So I just got back from talking to the governor. We just signed an MOU with Nova Scotia in our attempt for all of the above energy to MOU with them to continue discussions with them about collaboration between us and Canada on transmission, on energy, sort of helping them with lessons learned that we've learned in offshore wind workforce issues. So excited about that. We've spent a significant amount of time in Canada here, and I think we're making some progress there. So I apologize for being late and not being in my right place. But I do appreciate that. Again, I know I have said this every time that I've come here, but I do appreciate the time to spend on these meetings. I think if nothing else, it brings everybody together in one room and everybody can hear everybody else's opinions. And I think it's really helpful for sort of the whole ecosystem to be together and to try to work things out together, even if we can't always agree. I just wanted to tell you sort of where our focus is at the moment. And right now we're laser focused on our energy affordability bill. The governor talked about it at the State of the Commonwealth that we're really focused on bringing in new clean energy online, lowering costs, reducing price volatility, and leveraging the innovation and the talent that we have in Massachusetts. And the biggest thing that we have going right now to get that done is the affordability bill. So I just also wanted to thank the many of you who have participated in discussions about the affordability bill and what that might look like. I know that there's been a lot of back and forth. I know people provided ideas to the legislature. I know everybody is working hard to get the best bill that we can. The legislation, that we filed, we think would lower bills by $13 billion. It includes policies to avoid spending on infrastructure by leveraging demand response, like you all have been talking about. It helps energy get connected to the grid faster and cheaper and gets better prices for customers. And as you know, we've read it, it also reduces costs and gets charges off the bill, eliminates hidden fees and various items that we hope will lower customers' bills And many of those ideas came from talking to the people in this room, and it was a group effort to come up with the bill in the first place, and I'm sure that the end result also be a group effort. But groups like this still remain important to have discussions that are occurring today, and I know that you all in working groups in particular are tackling tough issues that there are no easy solutions for, no easy answers. Evergreen terminal and decarbonizing the peak, financing the transition, and enabling sustainable economic development are not exactly like small little issues. They are the issues that we are all dealing with in our careers right now. And it's a lot to balance in each of those issues, but I know that working groups are attempting to do that, slogging kind of these issues one by one, asking hard questions and having really honest conversations. So appreciate that. And I do see this as a model for finding common ground to make progress. Sometimes not as quickly as we all would like, sometimes not as we would all like, but doing it in the right way to have lasting change. So I want to commend the group that's working on Everett. As you all know, the DPU last week approved a supply contract to help reduce reliance on Everett and lower costs for some Eversource customers. In that order, the DPU sided the work of this group. But there is more work to be done, as we just heard. There's a lot of things that need to be done to make us more energy independent and make more energy affordable and continue to make our state more competitive. So more than ever, appreciate all of your leadership, your innovation and creativity, and particularly your time in spending it here with us, tackling these really difficult questions. Thank you very much and enjoy your break.
Jeremy's gonna take
I know you gotta call us.
So we will be reconvening in 10 minutes. Okay.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's a.
Then we'll see you in 10. Keep it rolling. So maybe we can go to the next slide. So we're going to move now into discussing the financing the transition talk. So we'll again give you an update on progress, share some of the quantitative findings that have been emerging from our deliberations, talk about the recommendations we're in the process of developing, and then again have a vote about affirming where we are and where we're going. So we can go to the next slide. So I'm going to share a bit about the progress here since I'm also in the FPP FOG, and then I'm going to hand it over to our colleagues from Analysis Group to share a bit about the quantitative piece. In terms of where we are, as you can see on the slide, we are in phase 3. So you may recall at our last ETAB meeting, we shared an assessment framework that we've been developing and some color-coded assessments of how different financing alternatives performed across these various metrics. It looked like a very complex, multicolored flag. We took that, and now we're in the stage of using those findings to do some more quantitative work and develop some potential recommendations. Next slide. So how do we do that? Well, again, we had those assessments that came out of the last ETAB, and we asked for some written input from the group. What do you make of this? In light of what we see in these assessments, what do you think we should be advising policymakers on how or whether to move these different alternatives forward? We took that written feedback and we developed an outline of potential recommendations that included some possible findings, some shared goals, and some other elements, and we'll share at a high level what's in that in just a minute. And then we also heard some requests from the FOG around additional quantitative analysis to understand what are the actual potential bill impacts of these different financing alternatives over time. So what does traditional rate making look like if we're adding a certain quantity of infrastructure onto the distribution network, right? What are the bill impacts of that? And then if we add that same quantity, but funnel it through these different alternative financing mechanisms, what difference does it make? So we've done some quantitative analysis on that. We'll share some initial outputs of that. And our next step after today, we're continuing to refine that quantitative analysis. We have gotten some feedback on our outline from the FOG. And so we plan to, assuming the permission of ETAB here today, to develop that into an actual written draft, zero draft, so to speak. And then over the course of the upcoming FOGs, we expect to do a good process to try to build consensus and alignment on that package, that portfolio of recommendations. And we do expect, we hope that by the next ETAB, we'll have something clear and concrete in terms of written recommendations for you all to consider and vote on. So next slide. Let me just check, do we have Paul still available online to share these quantitative pieces? Or is it Scott now? Okay, Scott, okay. So great. Paul had to head off a little bit early, so we're gonna hear from Scott, who's gonna walk us through the quantitative analysis that the analysis group has been doing. So go ahead, Scott.
Thanks, Toby. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. And sorry we can't be there today. But as Toby noted, I'm a colleague of Sue Tierney and Paul Hibbard, and we worked on putting together the quantitative analysis. So at a high level, the analysis was focused on illustrating how a $1 billion investment in distribution infrastructure could be translated into a revenue requirement to be recovered from ratepayers under the status quo or a traditional rate making approach, and comparing that to 4 financing approach alternatives listed here. So just to go into each of those in a little more detail, the traditional approach assumes that investment results in a return on capital incorporating both debt and equity financing as well as a depreciation expense portion. The securitization approach assumes the investment is fully debt financed, and the revenue requirement for the cost of the principal and the interest on securitization is levelized over the 40-year recovery period. And for now, we've assumed that cost of debt at 4%, but are considering alternative sensitivities with different cost of debts. The public-private partnership option assumes the capital investment is split between a private partner, and here we modeled that as the utility, and the public partner assumed at a 50-50 split, and the public partner is able to finance by either issuing bonds and or grants that are then repaid through taxes or ratepayers. And so in this example, we've demonstrated a public-private partnership, both with a taxpayer-funded portion and a debt finance portion. The next would be the clean energy tariff, and this option allows individual customers, whether that be data centers or other large loads that need to request utility upgrades or investments ahead of schedule. The tariff allows the utility to directly assign a portion of the overall investment, so a portion of the $1 billion investment to those customers, and reduces the investment required from the utility for other ratepayers. And finally, the state revolving fund. This would involve an initial seed fund coming from government grants or bonds, taxpayers, or private investment. And the fund then provides low-cost loans to utilities to finance projects. And both the repayment of the principal and the loan repayment could then be recycled for subsequent investments, leading to some level of a multiplier effect. And before walking through a couple of these charts, just a general note, as mentioned, we're assuming a $1 billion investment in distribution infrastructure recovered over a 40-year period using illustrative financing assumptions for Massachusetts investor-owned utilities, commercial debt markets, and for contributions from other non-ratepayer parties, whether that's specific large customers or a general fund. And our analysis attempts to focus on the relative comparison between options using these common assumptions, but doesn't naturally account for actual conditions that might exist at the time or indirect and second-order impacts of certain options. And as Toby noted, we continue to discuss and review in the FOG alternative underlying assumptions and how they may impact the results. So getting into the charts here, we have 2 charts where we demonstrate both in nominal terms and in real terms discounting at the utility weighted average cost of capital but under each of the options that we went through, what the annual revenue requirement would be in each year over the 40-year time horizon. And I think a couple things to call out. The top line here is illustrating the traditional rate of return regulation approach, where the return is earned on a rate base and a depreciation expense is incorporated, and nominally that value declines over time. Where we see the securitization approach, because that debt is incorporated and levelized over time, the nominal return from ratepayers is equivalent year over year. And then a couple of the other options illustrate some of the dynamics here. So for the clean energy tariff, rather than $1 billion investment, if we were to assume some portion here for illustrative purposes, we're assuming 100 million is recovered from individual customers. The total investment is reduced and the recovery over time is also reduced. And then the last point I would note is for the public-private partnership options, because these are incorporating both components of traditional rate of return regulation and levelized debt cost over time. These nominal costs are higher than solely debt cost in the short term, but lower in the long term. And if we flip to the next slide. Here, as mentioned, we're taking the nominal cost and discounting them over time based on the utility weighted average cost of capital to kind of illustrate in net present value what could be the cost impact on ratepayers that needs to be recovered. And I think the key thing to note here, and one of the benefits of levelization of certain costs, is the net present value of cost is reduced in the short term if those costs are spread nominally over a longer period. And if we flip to the last slide, the last thing we wanted to illustrate here is translating this overall revenue requirement needed to be recovered from customers. How could this translate into a potential monthly bill addition for residential customers? So for both the traditional approach and securitization approach, we translated the revenue requirement in relevant years. So here in years 1, 5, 10, 20, 30, and 40 into potential monthly bill additions for residential customers of each utility. And how we did that, and the detailed notes are on the side. But essentially, we took the annual revenue requirement, split it out to utility-specific revenue requirements based on each utility's current share of the electric load. We translated that into a residential-specific revenue requirement based on rate class revenue allocation percentages. And then we translated that to a per kilowatt hour per consumption amount based on estimated annual consumption for a residential customer of each utility. And then using some additional assumptions from recent rate cases on total consumption and number of monthly bills, we're able to translate that into a total bill addition. And the takeaway here, I think, with the levelization of securitization, that monthly bill addition is constant over time. We're under the traditional approach that declines over time, but looking at the y-axis and the total bill addition of $1 billion investment is 8 to 15 cents, and that makes up a fairly small portion of current residential customer bills. So I will pause there, see if Toby, there's anything to add or any questions.
Thanks, Scott. We'll talk a little more about some of the recommendations we've been developing, so you can all have those in front of you as well, and then we'll turn to questions. So next slide, please. So these were in your materials, and this is essentially the outline that we've been developing of our potential recommendations. So in whatever we come up with, it will obviously include background of what we as a FOG have done. And then we've been working on developing some shared goals that reflect what we think the Commonwealth should be aiming for when it comes to financing the transition and some of these alternative approaches. So those include utilizing a range of alternative financing mechanisms to try to mitigate the impacts, some of the lumpiness of potential future rate impacts. We note some of the potential benefits of alternative financing mechanisms. We are going to we'd like to know the importance of ensuring LMI and environmental justice benefits, and also thinking about negative potential consequences of side effects, like taxpayer impacts, harm to utility credit ratings or increased business risks, et cetera. We think that the Commonwealth should be thinking about packages that work well together. So a lot of these alternative approaches can be and potentially should be combined. And then we've talked about how it's important to think about getting some of these measures in place in the short term, given the lumpiness of rate increases that we are already experiencing and that we know the administration has concerns about with respect to its affordability bill, as we just heard, but also keeping in mind the long term and how do we try to minimize costs through demand reduction and other measures over that long term. Next slide. Some of the core strategic findings that we're playing with at the moment, noting that we think a portfolio of different approaches are going to be needed, that these alternatives can materially reduce bill impacts, but the impact of financing alone is actually limited, right? So this is not going to hugely decrease bills, right? It needs to be part of a broader package of measures. New revenue sources to try to finance the transition, they can have potentially larger bill impacts, but there are real hurdles to implementing those. There are real long-term benefits to demand reduction, and the group is really focused on what can we say around how to encourage that over the long term. How much of these alternative measures is a really critical unknown, and we have some different thinking on that within the group. One of the things we've heard from utilities is, if you take some of these off of traditional utility rate making, what impact does that have on the demand for equity return, the tolerance for risk, et cetera? So exactly what the appropriate scale is not something that we can articulate clearly at this time. And then equity needs to be engineered into these approaches from the beginning, not just backfilled after the fact. So we anticipate expounding on some of those recommendations or those findings. We then, and this I think is an important way to think about the recommendations that we're going to be developing. We are going to lay out essentially what do each of these alternative financing approaches do and where might it fit in a portfolio. And if you are a policymaker and you want to do X, what kinds of alternative financing approaches should you do? Or if you want to do Y, what kind of approaches should you be thinking about? So we are not so much envisioning saying, do securitization and a state revolving fund, but not these other things, right? It's not like A, but not B. It's more like, here are different potential packages and how they could tie to different goals that you may have, right? So that was one of the clear things that has come out of our deliberations to date. Folks don't feel like we can just say, X, but not Y, or rank these in some way. They serve different purposes, and they could be in a portfolio in different ways. Okay. So next slide. We're going to not do the vote quite yet. We're going to do some Q&A, but that is essentially our update on where we are. I will say we're going to continue doing quantitative analysis, including some potential sensitivity analysis, and fleshing out those recommendations in the coming months. So, questions, reactions? Great. Okay, looking around the room. Okay. I do not have a chance. That's right.
Great, thank you. Maggie Superchurch with the Massachusetts Community Climate Bank at Mass Housing. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you're thinking about engineering equity into solutions and how that will be developed over the next few months.
Great question. So there are a couple of pieces that I think are talking about. One is essentially articulating in our recommendations, what does it mean to build in equity from the outset? So some principles for policymaking. Okay, so for example, actually designing for equity in the structure of the mechanisms that you're using versus backfilling through credits or other mechanisms is going to be less effective. Another thing that we're imagining is, can we, and I think this is another question, we haven't determined this yet, but disaggregate some of these bill impacts according to the communities in question, right? So what would it mean for particular ratepayer or a ratepayer on a different rate or an environmental justice community, et cetera. What's going to happen on that, Melissa?
Yeah, no, I think part of it is exactly what Toby said. And as we're going through some of the analysis to understand two different mechanisms have different impacts on folks that are on, say, a discounted rate. Right. So would one have more or less of an impact? Probably it's going to be similar to other customers, but we don't know. So just even understanding that, this portfolio approach, if a customer is on a discounted rate, depending on how applied, it may or may not have as much of an impact as if, on other customers. So those are the kinds of things that we want to make sure we understand.
Hi, I'm Carrie Coleman with Vineyard Offshore, but my question is not necessarily tied to my company. I'm just curious. Did you, when thinking about securitization, did you look at kind of the history of securitization in Massachusetts and bill impacts and kind of how that, I guess the history and what that has meant over the past 25 years in Massachusetts ratepayers?
Yeah, yes, we started with looking at how it was used in Massachusetts, how it appears in the bill and how it was structured. And then we also did look at how it's being used across the country in other states.
I want to just ask folks, ice cream cone rule, right? So right up on your mouth. We've heard from online that they really appreciate that. Lick the ice cream. Don't actually lick it. Within that distance.
Yeah, I no longer have a question. And this question actually does have something to do with our company. I'm still really concerned with the securitization recommendation and the analyses that have been included in the package. On the one hand, I see in the outline that there will be some assessment of the implications of securitization for the overall cost of capital for existing debt holders, for existing equity holders. Yet the charts from analysis group, I think, referred to those we consider very important issue with second order effects. In our view, they are entirely first order effects. Asking our owners, our equity investors, to retain operating risk but not be compensated for that risk is something that's extraordinarily difficult for us to do. As managers with a fiduciary responsibility to those equity holders. So I just want to be sure that as we go forward on that issue in particular, the issue of securitization in particular, that we will take a very thorough look at the overall effects, that we will not just isolate it to the cost being 5% for 40 years. It's far more.
That's a great point. And that's what, when we write things up, we're going to have to be very thorough on each one of those, right? They at a high level, they all might look like this, but at a detailed level, they all have different implications, including ones where we're looking at things like state revolving. Where does that money come from? Right. So there is a secondary impact of that. So we're going to have to do that. And so appreciate that. We're also going to be having some small work groups on things so that we can dive deeper into each one of these and then ladder that up.
So you're lucky to have your own ice cream.
I do.
Let me just look around the room. Any more hands from folks in the room? Okay, Catherine, are there any online? 2 online? Okay. Let me open this up.
Sorry. Yes, we have Senator Barrett and Mary.
Great. So let's hear from both of them. Go ahead, Senator Barrett.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Terrific. A very quick look at the slides that we just looked at suggests that securitization, for example, is less expensive than traditional financing for the entirety of 30 years of the full 40 years of financing. And a visual scan of that sort, a kind of careless visual scan, if you will, a quick one, would lead one to believe that over the course of the entire 40 years, securitization costs less money overall. I want to channel now my colleagues in the legislature who have asked me a question that seems to go in the other direction. They've remarked to me that debt financing, which involves interest as well as principal, must be over the course of 40 years more expensive than pay as you go, which we could apply as phrasing to the traditional method of finance where the rate base is involved with a little delay. So I have a request and a question. The request is that some portion of the final report discuss these kinds of issues in layperson's language. There are sophisticated reasons, I know, why an alternative to traditional financing might be cheaper overall, whatever overall means. But the legislators who have to approve securitization, if it's to become a legal option, and have to approve it this year in this energy affordability bill, will want to know how financing a loan, essentially, and paying interest on the loan is less expensive than paying through the rate base. And so I too want to make sure both that the language, that these issues are explored for the layperson who's going to be reading, but then I also have a substantive question of my own, and it's that one again. Are we to conclude, correcting for the cost of capital over time, that one can essentially rely on debt and pay less money than if one were paying as you go? One of two things, I presume, might make this so. One is that there's an offset to the cost of financing debt, which cancels out the additional cost, which does exist, of financing debt, and still leaves us in the black, as it were, with securitization, a better overall deal than pay-as-you-go financing. But the alternative explanation maybe is that there's something unintentionally misleading about the graphics we've been looking at, which certainly, again, in a quick way, does suggest that for 30 of the 40 years, securitization is the better deal, and then visually, that over the course of the entirety of the 40 years as well, securitization is a better deal. So a layperson's explanation for a few of these issues would help us when these issues come to be discussed in the legislature. But I also have a substantive question about whether there are offsets that make the total cost less onerous, or whether the total cost, in fact, is more burdensome, but is nevertheless commends itself because there's a smoothing out of costs in the near term.
So that's a great two-part question. So first,
and by the way, Melissa, may I say, Melissa, that the camera doesn't show the front of the room, so unfortunately we can't see you or any of the other speakers at the front of the room. But maybe that's unavoidable.
All right, if you move over here, can you see me now?
Yes, perfectly.
No, great two-part question. So for the first part, a short answer is yes, absolutely. We are going to try to make the recommendations or report as understandable as we possibly can, and put it as much plain language as we can on each one of these. So great feedback, and yes. On your second question, in terms of what's being shown on the graph, under traditional rate making for an infrastructure investment, so for something that is a capital expense, a capital investment like a substation, et cetera, those the investment associated with that, the cost associated with that, is actually not recovered pay as you go. It's recovered over time. So what that slide is showing is it's recovered over time over a schedule, so it's depreciated. And so under traditional rate making, the utilities earn off of the undepreciated amount over time. And so they earn at their essentially weighted average cost of capital is what the financing is associated with that, which has a debt and equity component. So that's what you were seeing on the top line of that first graph. So that's why it was sort of starting up higher and then goes lower over time, because as you depreciate, you're applying the financing to a smaller amount of the undepreciated capital expense versus securitization, where that is essentially kind of debt financing. So there's not an equity component, essentially a form of debt financing. And Bob indicated there's lots to go into that. So I'm just simplifying this. And so under securitization, you are also putting a financing charge on it, but it is a lower financing cost, but it is levelized and smoothed over time. So that's the difference, but neither one of them is pay as you go.
Thanks, Melissa. All right, I see we have one more question online, Mary, and then we're going to go to a vote. Go ahead, Mary.
Yeah, mine is not a question, but it's sort of a response. I had Maggie Superchurch's question on equity, and I also had Melissa's response, and I wanted to add mine in there just to say that while this FOG is about financing the transition, that traditional grid financing, even ideas like securitization, are often at odds with equity. Therefore, to bake in equity truly, I think at the end of the day, this FOG or ETAB will have to acknowledge that there's a need to work around the grid and think about distributed energy resources as solutions to baking in equity. I clearly understand that this is just about financing, but the truth is financing has left vulnerable people behind for generations, and that needs to be acknowledged. And then Melissa's response identified the discount rate, but I want to say that the challenge of energy affordability in the Commonwealth goes far above the discount rate. Thank you.
Aaron. Joe, can you please just keep it brief if you can? Yeah.
And this will be the last part.
Katie Center.
Got it.
During the we're happy. During the working group meetings that I participated in, Ben Underwood brought forward a proposal that suggested that the group consider investments in distributed energy resources implemented on the distribution grid behind the customer's meter be considered as an alternative to traditional distribution system upgrades. You'll agree it wouldn't prevent or wouldn't foreclose the need for all distribution system upgrades, but might avoid the need for some. And I wonder if Ben's proposal is going to be continue to be considered as part of this work.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So with that, let's take it to our vote. So you can see on your screen the proposition that you're being asked to vote on, right? To affirm the FOG's work and approach to date, the proposed approach for moving forward in phase 3, and no objection to the FOG proceeding to develop our recommendations as was presented. So we'll start in the room. All in favor? All opposed? I see none. Any abstentions? Okay, I see 4 abstentions. Okay, great, thank you. Online, any opposed online?
No hands.
No hands. Any abstentions online?
No hands.
Don't see any. Great. And those of you with concerns, please follow up. We're now going to move to our 4th and final thought. So we're going to have Catherine come on up and share with us the Enabling Sustainable Economic Development FOG update. We're going to hear from Catherine, and then we're going to have an opportunity for some brief small group discussions on this. So stay tuned for that. Go ahead, Catherine.
Hello, everyone. I'm Catherine O'Malley. I'm the Deputy Executive Director in the Office of Energy Transformation. I'll be talking about an update on the Enabling Sustainable Economic Development Focus Area Group. So I'm going to give a presentation on where we're at in phase 2 or phase 1, and then what we've decided to kind of take a deeper dive into for phase 2 to get advisory board feedback and some small group discussions. So go to the next slide. So a reminder of why we have this focus area work group. So the risk gap problem that we've identified in this FOG. So in order to build on the grid, right, the utility requires the customer commitment and payment before making that grid investment to make their prudency case for cost recovery. So if they want to build out on the grid and put that asset in place, they need to kind of defend that with the DPU in their prudency case. On the other hand, you have the business. That upfront payment and the uncertainty around timing and the magnitude of the cost can really present a financial barrier, and especially before the new project is operational. And so that's where you have this sort of risk gap, where the utility can't take on that risk without knowing that they can recover it in their prudency case with the DPU, and the business has trouble with that upfront payment, taking on that risk themselves. That's where economic development can stall. So we're trying to figure out how can we close this gap. So go to the next slide. So in phase 1, we did a lot of information gathering and research and understanding the complexity behind this topic. So first we met with businesses to understand their energy and site needs by sector or business. We determined current barriers to energy and interconnection and development. And then with the FOG, we reviewed current load connection process for large load customers in Massachusetts. And we reviewed a lot of grid planning and investment recovery processes that we have now. So the ESMPs and the ESMP factor are 2 of the main examples there. And then we started to identify 4 main topic areas that we explored further with the focus area work group. And those are economic development rates, cost recovery models, energy supply, and pilot site selection. So to enable these clean energy ready zones, we identified these 4 topics as something to explore further. And so we had small group discussions with the focus area work group where we got feedback and kind of dive deeper into these topics. So if you go to the next slide. So this is a lot of text, and I encourage you to read it on your own time if you're interested to learn more about the takeaways from those small groups. Basically, we talked about potential structures for the economic development rates. We talked about also the contribution and aided construction kayak consideration. For cost recovery models, again, we talked a lot about ESMPs and the ESMP factor for cost recovery. We also talked about the prudency standard, which we'll kind of see come up again. For pilot site selection, we talked about the differences between urban, suburban, and rural areas, the takeaways with or the trade-offs with each of those, and also talked about the opportunities for coordinating with interested municipalities and businesses. And then finally, energy supply. There's a lot to talk about there. But we talked about energy supply constraints, as well as de-risking new clean energy through collaborative state procurements, freeing up capacity with load management. And we talked about bundling different programs to kind of all help contribute to how do we bring clean energy to these zones. And so in having these small group discussions, we identified 3 kind of main work streams as we see it, to really focus on and dive deeper into phase 2. And as we go into the small group discussions, we're hoping to get your feedback on each of those. Go to the next slide. Those 3 kind of main work streams that we identified were exploring if an economic development rate could be applied in Massachusetts and what that might look like, reviewing the current prudency standard for potential changes required to enable that proactive grid build out for these zones. And then finally, selecting a pilot site. So providing a real world example of what this could look like in Massachusetts, real world challenges, and figuring out how this could really work. So if we go to the next slide, now I'm going to go into each one of these in a little bit more detail. So an economic development rate. This is a special discounted utility rate offered to attract or retain businesses in a region. And it's usually in exchange for commitments like job creation, capital investment, or long-term operations. So it's usually a long-term contract with the utility at this rate. And it's provided to the incremental load of that business. So it's large new load. So therefore, it's benefiting the business that's getting this special discounted rate, as well as all ratepayers by spreading fixed costs among more load, more ratepayers. So it exists in states like California, Maryland, and New York, which currently have a form of an economic development rate, and we are exploring those as potential examples for Massachusetts, what this might look like here. So if we go to the next slide, the prudence review standard. So a prudence review applies to all capital investments incurred by utility when they file for their capital cost recovery, in the rate case. The review analyzes the need for an investment for an asset that's been placed in service. It's based on what the utility knew or should have known at the time the investment was made. If the expenditure is deemed prudently incurred and the resulting plant is used and useful, the utility may recover those costs. There are occasional exceptions to having it be placed in service, like smart meters as an example. But the FOG is exploring how regulation may need to change to allow cost recovery for proactive grid build out. So when you don't necessarily have that customer yet, or you don't have that commitment to help make that prudence review case at the GPU, what might need to change to allow that. So if we go to the next slide, finally tying this all together with a pilot site. So we're interested in choosing a site where we can test some of this out and pilot what this could really look like in Massachusetts. And so we're currently working with the Executive Office of Economic Development and suggestions from FOG members to identify a site that has some level of development started, but doesn't have the energy capacity it needs to attract its target businesses. So we can try and test some of this out and see what would really be needed in a real world example, what challenges might come up to address this. And so if we go to the next slide, so just be queuing up our small group discussions. But as we go into phase 2, we're looking to explore those. Can we bring an economic development rate to Massachusetts? What might need to change in a prudence review standard to allow for this proactive grid build out? And then finally, selecting a pilot site. We're also very curious to have advisory board member feedback on what might go into that. So keeping those 3 things in mind, that's kind of what some of our discussion questions are going to be asking in those small groups. And we're really curious to kind of get your feedback on, is this the right track for what you're thinking of for the enabling sustainable economic development FOG? What considerations should we keep in mind? What challenges? So I think we're going to move right into breakout groups.
Great, thanks, Catherine. Yeah, so we're going to head right into breakout groups to discuss this. So you can stay right where you are. We have some facilitators and note takers who are going to go around and disperse themselves at each of the tables. We're going to do this for about 15 minutes in small groups. Then we're going to come back and hear just a couple takeaways from the facilitators of each of the groups around highlights of maybe 1 or 2 key items that came out or themes. And then we're going to do our vote on this after that. So I just want to note the report out from the facilitators by necessity is going to be quite limited. It's just going to be 1 or 2 takeaways, but we have note takers who are capturing all of the points, and those will then funnel into the minutes that are being grabbed. Okay, so do not worry if all of your points are not raised at the end. They're going to be incorporated into what we take away and bring back to the file. So with that, let's go ahead. We can go to the next slide, which I believe has the questions. Great. So we're interested to hear your thoughts on your economic development rates and the prudency review standards. What do you want to make sure the FOG considers or assesses in its deliberations on those issues? And similarly with the pilot sites, do you agree with the approach that we heard from Catherine in general? What do you think is important for the FOG to consider as it works to identify potential sites? What attributes are important in a site for learning by the FOG and the advisory board? So those are some of the prompts. I think we're just interested in your reactions and your advice. So with that, we'll let you get started and we'll come back in 15 minutes. Facilitators maybe gather some of their thoughts around some of the key takeaways they might want to name. But I'll just say from my group, one of the pieces of advice that they wanted to offer the FOG was to really be clear and transparent on identifying, quantifying where possible both sides of the ledger here, both the benefits that we're seeking to obtain and also the risks that we're incurring. So on the benefit side of the ledger, there's a recommendation that among the criteria for designing a development site, for choosing a site, for designing this program should be the development of a community benefits framework, right? So that could determine where this takes place, what exactly it looks like, but are we looking at issues like local hires, equity, et cetera? Thinking about the site, denser versus more open sites, right? Proximity to transmission, et cetera. These should all be accounted for. On the benefit side of the ledger, right? Is this going to be an all electric industry? Are these industries that are specifically of interest for the Commonwealth to attract? So trying to get more granular on what we're trying to achieve and how to achieve those things and how those could be quantified. And then on the risk side, the flip side of that, how do we actually quantify what does it mean to depart from the prudency standard? What does it mean to offer this discount rate? Who is going to cover those and how much does that actually mean for other ratepayers and other stakeholders? So again, drilling down into quantifying both sides of that ledger. So with that, let me see. Melissa, do you want to be the next presenter here? One or two key takeaways?
Sure, thanks. So we had a good conversation, a couple things. One, in terms of pilot sites, we have discussion around should we be thinking not in terms of one, but maybe a few to look at geographic diversity of potential sites. So, Western, Central, Eastern Mass. And then we did talk about the fact that the FOG had also talked about both geographic diversity, but also diversity of maybe urban, suburban, rural. So that could fit nicely that they're all going to have different issues. And so that would be important. We had a good discussion of economic development rates that they essentially they could be helpful, and a lot of the same issues came up that I think to be the great. And what are you discounting for how long? Who pays? How do you manage through that? So that making sure that as we're talking about that, we are talking deeply about those. We also then had a conversation around prudency versus used and useful. So now we're getting into terms of art on utility, but essentially, right, it's the difference between, we could all say, yes, the utilities did what they did, they should have done it based on what they knew. However, you still can't put it in rates yet because it's not fully used and useful. So who then, how do you manage that period of time? So I think it's all wrapped up in prudency. That's something that we would need to think through as we're thinking through how to proactively build out the grid. And then we did have a discussion on some of the capacity constraints are not at the distribution level, but maybe the transmission level. So is there a way to think through that in the context of so I think that captures most of the.
Melissa? Okay. Okay.
I'm going to try to add, because a lot of the points that have been already raised were discussed here. I think on the prudency piece, it was important and emphasized to make sure that the economic benefits are ones that we want to socialize across all ratepayers. So make sure the economic benefit is something that is important to address. For the pilot sites, I think it was also raised to consider if there's other creative ways to achieve other objectives of the community and the state. So is it offshore wind, demand response pilots? And then also think about don't pick the hardest spot. So if there's some reason that it's hard to get businesses there, pick something that's interesting, where there's an economic development opportunity, and also there's the community wants it as well.
And is it going to be over here?
Great. I'll just name a few points that were raised by this group. One is to think about the design of economic development rates and whether or not there are cost shifts to other customers and how those are designed and who gets them and how much are we willing to impose on other customers. Maybe along the same lines, being really clear on the costs and benefits associated with the economic development. What are guardrails we can put in place to ensure that the projects generate benefits to customers, ratepayers, the state. And just being very clear at front, I think, on what those metrics are was something we heard was very important. Another thing we heard is it's going to be really important to identify what has worked in other jurisdictions, were there lessons learned, were there characteristics that made, some of these economic development initiatives successful. We sort of aggregate that information to inform what we do here in Massachusetts. There was a theme we heard around making sure that we are, maybe building on the metrics piece, identifying sites that are priorities or industries that are priorities. One of the things that came up is whether or not we can target sites or benefits to those who have been impacted by the energy transition, those in fossil fuel industry or otherwise. Something else I think that's kind of related to the sites was around kind of coordination with other economic development and state efforts to facilitate, for example, housing in the state and other priorities, and how would these economic development zones line up with that? I think a theme was really around to what extent is the electricity sector kind of the rate limiting step for economic development vis-a-vis other challenges or barriers to economic development, whether that is the cost of housing, for example, or other kind of cost of living here in Massachusetts. There is a theme we heard around, what about kind of non-rate based options for encouraging economic development. You can think about, pace of interconnection and penalties for not achieving kind of some of the other requirements for new industries to develop in the state. So I think that captures most, but not all of what we heard here.
So much, Liz. And Catherine, last one, just a couple takeaways.
Yes,
Yeah,
also,
so-
Sorry, Catherine online, we'll get to you in a minute. Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
got several Catherines here.
Yeah.
Most of what we said was actually already said, but we also talked a lot about clean generation, kind of bringing your own clean generation to these sites. We talked about targeting sites for like a group of companies or organizations that we're hoping will stay in Massachusetts, either establish or stay in Massachusetts. And we also talked about flexible demand, how that can, especially for the clean generation, how that can add to the general.
Great, thanks, Catherine in person. Catherine online, share with us what you heard in your group.
So last but not least, we covered all of that, all of the above. I think we touched on almost all of that. There's 2 points that I haven't heard yet that some members of our group made. One is that, if we want to set up these clean energy zones that promise benefits in terms of jobs and other kind of economic benefits, we want to be sure that it's not just generalized and that it's actually jobs that, for instance, that go to the community and jobs that go to a diverse set of workforce. So again, more direct community benefits are seen. And then the other one I thought was really interesting was that how could these types of economic development rates be structured so that they can also be fair to the existing businesses in the state who might be expanding? They may not be in a clean energy zone. They also are trying to decarbonize and have these costs. How are they being given consideration? Would they be eligible for these types of rates?
Thank you, Catherine. Thanks to all the facilitators for the report out. So we're gonna now move to a vote on this. So you can see the terms we're asking you to vote on there on your screen. So essentially that you affirm the phase 2 work plan of this FOG, including the possibility of identifying pilot sites for clean energy ready zones. So again, this vote is accounting for all the feedback that's been heard in the room, and also that will be forwarded to the FOG based on the minutes that have been taken, the notes. So with that, all in favor? Okay, great. All opposed? Okay, see none. Any abstentions in the room? And we see one abstention. Did I miss a vote? Oh, great. So we have one abstention in the room online. Any opposed? Okay. Don't see any. Yeah. Any abstentions online?
Not seeing any.
Okay. Great. All right. Thanks so much, folks. So it looks like the motion passes. So just a few next steps, and then we'll let you get on your way. We don't have the next ETAB meeting scheduled. We're looking most likely in early June. In the interim, the FOGs are going to continue doing their work, as we heard today. Just a reminder, if you want to follow up with us on anything, the point that you didn't have a chance to raise, please do so. Send an email, we check it, take it seriously. The next ETAB, as we've heard, is likely going to include some more formal recommendations for you to evaluate and vote on. So stay tuned for that. This is really where things get kind of into the nitty gritty with the FOGs, and where this ETAB really has an important substantive role in approving concrete recommendations. So stay tuned for that. You should be hearing more from the FOGs in the coming months. As a reminder, we have that happy hour coming up at Carey Nation, right around the corner, 11 Beacon Street. I'll thank all of you on behalf of myself. A really great participation, great meeting, but let me hand over to Melissa for some final words.
So thank you again for the participation today, and really want to thank you all for the participation in the work groups and for your teams making them available. The products that you see are a product of all that great work and thinking and input. I think when I was looking at the periods and counting up the number of meetings, we looked at the periods and it was talking about, meeting number 13 for this group and meeting number 12 for that group. I realized we, probably once a week, we're having 30, 40, 50, 60, sets of stakeholders getting together to talk about these topics. That's tremendous. That's a lot of input, a lot of ideas, a lot of discussion. And as the secretary said, that was the purpose of this, right? We may not all agree, but hopefully we're building some understanding. We're understanding the complexities and nuances, and we're going to find some paths forward on some really challenging issues. So thank you again. Really appreciate the input and the time.